Okay, and thank you again, everybody, for joining us at this Junior Parent Night. Obviously, as we do move forward with the presentation, please bear with me as I may still be pausing to let in a few other latecomers as they try to get into the meet as well. But again, I'd like to welcome everybody to really the family kickoff for this much more active phase of the college application process. Obviously, as you all together with your children have worked through your time at Wheatley, it's been in preparation for what now becomes a much more active portion of the process. I do ask that everybody in attendance just please make sure their microphones are muted. We will certainly have time for questions at the end. Sorry, I'm getting quite a few people logging in. We will certainly have time for questions at the end. And before I introduce our speaker, Mr. Topher Bordeau from Dartmouth College, just a little bit of general housekeeping for everybody that I ask you to keep in mind. As you may recall, the counselors did meet with their 11th grade students in their caseloads on December 2nd to provide an initial overview of what to expect from this process. This evening is the next phase of that. It's an opportunity for you as parents to hear some valuable information regarding the process in preparation for the junior planning conferences. And so what those will be is next week, students and their counselors will meet individually to discuss course requests, as well as the recommendations that their teachers have made for core course recommendations for next year, placements for next year. And then the week of January 19th, that Martin Luther King week, counselors will begin hosting junior college planning meetings where they'll have the opportunity to sit down with you and your children to discuss their individual path through the college process. So just a little bit of timeline work that I do ask all of you to bear in mind. Also, the Wheatley School College Planning Guide. Our Guidance Advisory Council here in the district did work hard over the course of last spring, part of this summer and this fall, to put together a guide that can offer a lot of great information for your families as you move through the college application process. Of course, you'll hear a great deal of information from us as well as from our speaker, but please do feel free to refer to this guide as kind of a benchmark as you move forward as well. And that guide can be located on the Wheatley School Guidance website in the college information section, linked right at the top. Just in terms of college entrance exams, please do be aware if your child did take the PSAT or PACT, scores have been available for your review, and students should be preparing to take these exams over the next few months. I did share out a letter on December 11th or an email to junior families with information on how to make the best use of those scores in planning to take the SAT and ACT proper. I will be posting this PowerPoint on the website for those who could not attend. You will be able to access it after this presentation. And if you click there, it'll take you directly to a digital copy of that letter. So you can review it if you cannot find it in your email. And of course, your children will be utilizing Naviance. I did an overview on December 9th of Naviance for junior parents as an introduction into how students will be utilizing that over the course of junior year. I do have a copy of that PowerPoint available on the Wheatley Guidance website. You can access it at that link right there. And if you as a parent would like to set up a parent account, I did have a number of parent requests come in after that Naviance parent overview for parent accounts. Please send me an email at my email address linked there. And of course, you can find it on our district website, and I'll happily set up an account for you. And of course, as always, please don't hesitate to reach out to your school counselor with any questions. The college application process is just that. It's a process. It's certainly not an event. And it's an ongoing conversation between you and your counselor. And without further ado, I'd like to bring you to our speaker for this evening, Mr. Topher Bordeau. He is the Associate Director of Admissions at Dartmouth College. And Mr. Bordeau is an example of someone who will actually be sitting down on the other side of the table reviewing your children's applications to college as they come in next fall. So as this ongoing college process evolves for you, you're going to be hearing quite a bit from your counselor, from me, from our website, from our resources about what this process looks like. So I always find it helpful to get the insight from someone who sits on the other side of the table when it comes to college admissions. So without further ado, I'd really like to welcome Mr. Bordeau to speak to us here virtually at Wheatley. And of course, Mr. Bordeaux, before you begin, I'd also like to thank you very much for your time.
It's my pleasure. Thank you, Sean, and thanks everyone for jumping on the call tonight. You can see on the screen there, my full name's Christopher. I go by Topher. And so when I meet your kids or you, please do call me Topher. I am an Associate Director of Admissions at Dartmouth. I represent the college on Long Island and then also in India and the Middle East. And I've actually traveled to Wheatley, I think 3 times, either 2 or 3 times, obviously not this past fall, but each of the previous 2 falls, if not the previous 3 falls. And I've really enjoyed visiting each time I've gone. I think if you take nothing else out of what I'm about to share with you tonight, please do realize that there is a human on the other end of this application process, and for students, for your children, that human will be me. I will be the first reader of your child's application if they do apply to Dartmouth. I will not be the only reader, but I will certainly be the first one. And it's kind of my job to get a sense of their academic interest and academic achievement and how that looks within context of Wheatley and Long Island and the rest of our applicant pool. That's all way ahead of us, though. That's all a long way away, up to a year away. There are still applications trickling in for the January 2nd deadline, literally as we talk for next year's class. So instead of actually talking about the application process, I thought I'd back up a little bit and, maybe ground ourselves or just give a really broad overview of how my colleagues and I see the college search process happening for you and for your children. Then talk a little bit about the components that go into a college application. Then talk about some of the nitty-gritty of the application itself, really the essays particularly. And then finally zoom out a little bit again to talk about what highly selective admissions really means, and specifically kind of what happens after your children click submit. So really broadly speaking, one thing I appreciated that Sean mentioned a few times was he referred to this as a process. Applying is not an event. He talked about it being a process. And that is something that every student I talk to, I try to encourage them to focus on the process. I think while this is a process, I think it's really easy and natural to focus on the outcome, admit or deny, at any number of different schools. But I think that's actually not the best way to approach this, both from an outcome and deny perspective, and then also from the perspective of making the best use of it possible. And here's what I mean by this. So your children are juniors right now. So odds are pretty strong that about 18, 19, 20 months from now, their life is going to change fairly dramatically. They don't know where they're going to end up in college, but they're probably going to end up in college. If they're thinking about a place like Dartmouth, they probably have a lot of really great options, and one of them is almost certainly going to work out. And when it does, they're going to have, there's a very good chance that they're going to have a really good time. They're going to have a blast wherever they go. And again, since they're looking at Dartmouth, if they're looking at Dartmouth, they probably have a lot of really great options. And it's more likely that the single biggest determining factor in their education is not going to be the place they go, but the way they apply themselves wherever they are. So knowing that, 19, 20 months from now, they're going to be they're going to be somewhere where A, they enjoy, and B, they're going to get a good education. Knowing that can be helpful in thinking about this process, because there's going to be an outcome that is very likely going to result in your children being happy and in a place where they can get a good education. So I encourage people to think about this that way, because that takes some of the outcome-driven anxiety out of this process and shifts it and creates an opportunity to think about this process a little bit differently. I encourage students, instead of thinking about this as a means to an end, as something that leads to an outcome, I encourage students to think about their college search as a way to orient themselves with who they are, what they've done to get to this point in their lives right now, where they see themselves going in the future, and kind of how they connect those dots. We'll talk about the writing that's involved in a college application a little bit later, but it's very different. I'll say right now that it's very different than a lot of the writing they do in school. It's very reflective and it's aspirational, and that's a really important part of this orientation process. But I encourage students to think this way, to think of the application, the college search process and the application process as an orientation, because then no matter where they end up, if they do a really good job in this process, they'll have a much better idea of why it is they're going where they're going and what they want to do once they get there. So that's kind of the broad way I encourage students to think about this. I think getting down to kind of brass tacks, the college search now looks like everything else. It looks dramatically different than it did a year ago this time. Had you told any of us a year ago that, we were going to recruit and host and evaluate and admit a class without meeting them in person or having them on campus, that would have seemed baffling. And yet, as your children enter this application cycle, that is now the new normal. I think it's very likely, at least for Dartmouth, that all of our visit options for the spring and the summer are virtual. I don't think we'll be hosting any on-campus programming, tours, info sessions, or anything like that. I think they will remain virtual at least through the summer. That decision is made well above my pay grade, but I would bet an amount of money on that. And I guess, that's bad news, but the good news is that we kind of know how to do this now. We did all of our yield events for the current first years virtually, last April. We did all of our usual summer programming virtually over the summer. We did virtual school visits this fall. We kind of know how we approach this process. The challenge for you is that, how do you approach it? There will be no, college trips for families, or at least not nearly as many as they were. And for a lot of colleges, the question will be how do you find fit? You can do a lot of research on academic offerings and rankings and curricular format and all that stuff online. But the really important question is how do you get that moment, that aha moment that used to happen when a student stepped on a campus or walked around a quad or did something like that, or, traipsed through a dorm room? How do you find that fit? How do you find that connection without actually being in the physical place? That is the challenge that is almost unique to your children. To a lesser extent, the class ahead of them had to do the same thing. Dartmouth and all the other colleges like us are trying to replicate that process as best we can. It looks a little bit different at different places. At Dartmouth, we focus a lot on connecting students with high school students with current college students, so that they can just get an unfettered sense of what it's like to be a Dartmouth student. Other places might do it differently. I think more than anything else, this virtual process has kind of democratized the college travel process. I visited, quote unquote, more schools this fall than I had in past years. We hosted more virtual visitors than we had in the past. I think it's going to be easier logistically for you and your children to avail yourselves of the programming that colleges are offering, because it no longer involves a 6-hour trip up to Dartmouth or somewhere else. It's an hour on a Zoom call, for an info session or a tour or something like that. So this is different, certainly, than any of us expected it to look. I think I can say with confidence that my colleagues and I at Dartmouth, at least, and I would suspect at peer schools like us, we've done the very best job we can to reposition ourselves into the virtual world. And I'd like to think we're pretty good at it, but that's actually more your call than it is mine. I want to talk about a few kind of, I want to talk about kind of the next step now. And I have to apologize, by the way. I am not usually tongue-tied. Usually I'm actually, like you can imagine, I present a lot for my job, and usually I feel a lot more articulate than I do right now. I spent all day reading applications and literally have not spoken all day. So I feel a little bit rusty, and I apologize for that. But so after you go and kind of do your virtual travel and your virtual visits and all that stuff, it's going to come time to decide where to apply. And certainly, we talk about fit, like does a college offer what your child is looking for? Do they offer it in a way that's appealing to your child? Is the setting appealing, whether it's city or rural or whatever? Among all of those things, academic fit is a really important consideration. And so, I want to talk a little bit about what we think about, what my colleagues and I think about when we think about academic fit. We practice a version of admissions called holistic admissions, where really what that means is that we will look at the totality of an applicant's file. So, their grades, their testing, if it's there, their extracurricular involvement, their writing, the recommendations, all that stuff, all of it, before we lean one way or the other on a decision. In all of our training and all of our reading, we are encouraged we are encouraged to resist kind of thinking, oop, this might be an admit, or oop, I'm not sure, until we've read the entire file. So we read holistically. There's no one thing that does it, and there's no one thing that disqualifies students either. That being said, if there is a single most important part of the application, it is the academic component of the application. Over the past year, obviously, schools have been grading different ways. Some schools did not have grades last spring. Some schools' grades look different this fall. Everyone's adjusting to kind of a new normal. It is the work. It is a lot of the work of my colleagues and I to put achievement into context, to get a sense of what achievement looks like in different places, and get a sense of okay, what means what? And we've had to do a little bit of learning over the past year, certainly more learning than we expected to. But the good news is it's not that different, and the really good news is, I guess, in this pandemic, one thing that's actually stayed the same is the way we admit, which is this holistic process. And even though, academic achievement might look a little bit different in this day and age, we have a lot of tools at our disposal to put it into context. So, when we're evaluating for academic fit, we look at the student's transcript, certainly. We look at the school profile to get a sense of kind of what courses are offered at a school, what opportunities are offered at the school academically. We look at the transcript to figure out what opportunities the student has availed herself of, within the school. And then we look at the grades to get a sense of how the student has achieved in those opportunities. We also look at testing. Testing is always a super loaded topic, no time more than this year. We are test optional for the class of 2025. I'm not yet sure if we will be test optional for the class of 2026. I think that depends a lot on the college board. It depends a lot on, if students can get access safely to a test, and, we'll see. Testing and the transcript are two parts of one thing, which is demonstrated academic achievement. We are prepared to evaluate demonstrated academic achievement with or without a test. In application, certainly this year, and if we're test optional again next year, that's not test optional with a wink. It means we are truly test optional. And so, we could have, on one hand, a fantastic application with great grades and no test. And on the other hand, we could have a fantastic application with great grades and a great test. Those are both great applications. The application with a test is not at an advantage over the one without a test. They're both demonstrative of really strong academic achievement. If testing does come back next year, I think the important thing is just to get a sense of testing in the context of the application. It's just one part. If your child punts the SAT, okay, that's not ideal, but it's not a deal breaker. If they get a 1600, hey, good for them, but that's not a deal maker in and of itself. I think realizing that testing is one part of demonstrated academic achievement, and only one part of demonstrated academic achievement is really important. I will also say, let's say that testing comes all the way back and that, students are taking subject tests in addition to the SAT or the ACT. Dartmouth doesn't require subject tests. You'll see some schools they're totally optional. Some schools require them. Some schools they're recommended. We're on that recommended side. And really what that means is that we recommend that you use them if you need them to better demonstrate academic achievement. So to put that another way, if your child has straight A's on their transcript and they're really into biology and chemistry and they have a cold on the day they take the SAT or the ACT and they have a tough time on that, but then they have two really strong subject tests in biology and chemistry, they should submit those. And then we look at the subject testing, we look at the transcript, and we look at the SAT or the ACT, and the SAT or the ACT starts to look like the outlier. And the theme looks like strong achievement, strong academic achievement in the transcript and the testing with the subject tests. So I've talked a little bit about demonstrated academic achievement. I want to talk about the other components of a strong application. There are basically 5 components. The first I just mentioned. The second is intellectual curiosity. We are more interested in students who achieve highly because they're really curious rather than just, straight up super talented. We want the student who studies a lot because they like to. Every student studies because they have to, but we want the ones who like to as well. The third bucket we look at is kind of extracurricular engagement. This is a reflection of the fact that so much learning that happens on campus happens outside of the classroom. Dartmouth and colleges like us want students who are going to be engaged in the community outside of the classroom. The best indication that they'll be engaged on our campuses is that they're engaged in their communities in high school and in their towns. Extracurricular activities, need not just be at Wheatley. If students have a job or if they volunteer in the community or they do research, somewhere else in the community, or if they have family responsibilities, taking care of a sibling while you guys are at work or taking care of a grandparent, that's all engagement. That all basically shows that the student leads an involved life outside of the classroom, and we certainly look for that. And then the fourth and fifth bucket, if you will, that we kind of evaluate an application on they're a little squishier than the stuff I just mentioned. They're basically intellectual qualities and personal qualities. The way I talk about intellectual qualities to students is really simple. I ask them to think about what it is they geek out about and what that looks like. That's a demonstration of their intellectual qualities. For example, I'm a word nerd. I love writing. I love language. I just love words and linguistics and literature. I nerd out over Scrabble. I nerd out over grammar. And I do it in really dorky ways, but anyway, those are my intellectual qualities. A student's personal qualities are similar. Their personal qualities kind of are who they are, what they care about, what their values are, what their aspirations are, how they articulate their values, how they pursue their aspirations. A more concrete example of the personal qualities, what are the things they care about and how do they show their care? What does it mean for them to care about something? What do they do? How do they act? How do they feel? What does that look like? And those things give us a sense of how a student is in a classroom and is in a community, and what perspective and what voice they're going to bring to that community. All of these things are shared in one way or another in the application. I think it's obvious how demonstrated academic achievement is shared in the application through the testing and the transcript. I think intellectual curiosity will show up in an application, in the writing, in a student's writing, in the counselor recommendation and teacher recommendations. Extracurricular involvement, I think it's pretty obvious that shows up primarily on the activities section of the Common App. Students will very often also write about their extracurriculars in their essays. The intellectual qualities and personal qualities really tend to show up exclusively in the writing components of the essay, meaning what the students write, and then to a lesser extent, what teachers and counselors write in recommendations. And this makes the essays really important. And I talked about this earlier. When I was talking a little bit about this being a different kind of writing, the one thing that really ineffective essays, well, there is one thing that really ineffective essays have in common. And by ineffective, I mean ineffective in, contributing towards an admit decision, and also ineffective in helping students kind of orient themselves to who they are and where they want to be. And that single common ineffective element is that the essay will almost make a logical argument for their admission. They'll kind of present a case, if you will, and say, this is why I should be admitted to your school. It's my job to make that decision, and my colleague's job. We need our jobs. Let us do our jobs. So instead of kind of arguing for an outcome, what really good essays do, or what really good essays do, is share of themselves. I like Dr. Seuss went to Dartmouth, and so I like to use a phrase like the you-iest thing about you, which if it's not from Dr. Seuss, it feels like it's Dr. Seuss. Really good college essays will give the admissions reader like a sense of what the you-iest part of you is, both intellectually and personally. The prompts that go into these essay questions are open-ended. They encourage reflection. They are very deliberate. And so it's funny. I'm reading essays all day long today, these days, and for the next 3 months. Already in this admission cycle, I've noticed a tendency that happens every single year with essays. And I'll give you one tip right now to give to your kids, and maybe make sure it's the last thing they do before they finalize their essays and click submit. When they think they're done with their essay, have them read it, then have them read the prompt again, then have them read the essay again. I can't tell you how often I'll read an essay and say, that was a really great piece of writing, and it has absolutely nothing to do with the prompt. And I think the way that happens is that a student will answer the prompt and then revise the essay and revise it again, revise it again, revise it again. And with each revision, unknowingly, they'll move a little further away from the prompt. So that little nugget aside, I think like this essay is reflective. It's narrative. It gives us a glimpse into the life of a student. It gives us a glimpse into their values. It gives us a glimpse into their intellectual interests. Another thing a really good essay will do is make me feel like I know the student just a little bit, or at least I know what makes them tick. I move pretty quickly when I'm looking over grades and testing. Just for the simple fact that most grades and most testing are really pretty solid. I spend 90% of the time when I'm reading an application on the writing, and I will read it once. I will kind of like make mental notes about what in an essay. I'll read all the essays in an application once and just kind of make mental notes along the way about what seems interesting. Then I'll go back and read each one and make a few notes on it individually. And then I'll step back for a second and consider like what the totality of the narrative is that the student is sharing with me. This writing is a blend of intellectual and personal. I think good writing happens differently in an application than it does in a class. I encourage students to maybe treat this exercise a little bit differently than they treat classroom assignments. You know, personally, when I was in school and completing an assignment, I would have books open next to me, and I would write and consult with the book and write and consult with the book and write and consult with the book. This is different. There are no resources to consult with. And so it's really tempting just to sit in front of a computer screen and just decide that, like, you're going to get it done and just sit there and stare at the screen until the words come out. In my experience, like, that is the worst way to produce good writing. And sometimes I can read an essay and I can feel the student struggling to get the words out. It's like they want to make the words perfect. They want to say something super profound. And it's just like their writing is almost like verbally constipated, if you'll forgive a bad analogy. But instead, like, what I would encourage your kids to do is whatever it is that they love doing, that like restores them, makes them feel great about themselves, whether it's playing music or exercising or painting or reading or whatever, to go do that, to look at the prompt, go do that thing that makes them feel good for a while, and keep doing it until like some ideas about the prompt come into their head. And then when they get back from their run or whatever it is, just have them write down their thoughts. Just, you know, on a piece of paper, not on a computer, just on a piece of paper, 50 words, write it down, and then leave it alone. And then next time, before they do the thing they're going to do, that kind of restores their focus, makes them feel good about themselves, look at the prompt, look at their thoughts, and then go for that run again or play the guitar or whatever. And hopefully more thoughts develop. And do this like 4 or 5 times until the students have done their best thinking about a topic and around a topic. And then they can start writing. And if this process works the way I think it should, and often it does, the writing won't take very long. It won't be very hard. Like, I read a lot of essays and get the sense that, like, wow, this thing just flowed from the student's brain right into my brain, and it wasn't tortured. It wasn't labored. It was actually a really fun process. I think it's actually really bad writing that takes a long time and is really difficult. I think once students have figured out what it is they want to say and how they want to say it, the writing is actually pretty easy and happens quicker than they might expect. A couple more things about essays before I move on to highly selective admissions. You know, I think students feel a lot of pressure around 2 common themes. The first is they feel pressure to write something completely original, something that admissions officers have never read before. They don't need to do that. In fact, there's a risk in writing about something that admissions officers have never read before. You know, if I'm not familiar with a topic, the student has to spend at least a paragraph or 2 explaining it to me before they kind of write about it. And paragraphs are pretty valuable spaces on an application. Students don't need to write something completely original to have a really good essay. A common story can be a really good essay if it's told uncommonly well. And all I mean by uncommonly well is in the voice of the student. You know, think of this another way. There are almost 25, 30,000 applications to where I work each year. You know, students, no matter how niche their interests or no matter how distinctive their academic qualifications, their data, all that stuff is, there's almost certainly somebody else in the applicant pool with exactly the same interests and exactly the same academic data. There is certainly nobody else in the applicant pool with exactly the same voice as any given student. And so, you know, a really good essay can be a very common story, whether it's winning a big football game or baking cookies with mom or dad or grandma or grandpa or summer camp. Those are really common themes. And I've read a lot of really fantastic essays about those topics that are just told in the student's voice and just feel very unique to them. You know, if your student writes their essay and prints it out on a piece of paper without their name on it and without any identifying information, and leaves that piece of paper on a table in school, and someone picks it up and says, oh yeah, this is about Joey, or this is about Jenny, like they know it's about them, that's probably a pretty good essay. If it could be about anybody, that's not a very good essay. I think the second place where students feel a lot of pressure is in the quality of their writing, and making it like super floral and Shakespearean. That doesn't need to happen either. I think that, again, realize like we're evaluating kind of intellectual qualities and personal qualities. We're not evaluating quality of writing. Okay. I think it's possible, and very possible, to write intellectually compelling topics in very plain writing. Not everyone needs to be Shakespeare. Like engineers don't need to be Shakespeare. That being said, like, verbs should agree with their, like the grammar should be good and the spelling should be fine. And like now seems an appropriate time for this joke. Everything should be proofread. Your children should be aware that D and F are really close to each other on the keyboard. And if their fingers substitute F for D when they're spelling Dartmouth, it's really unfortunate. That would be an example of really bad writing. But they need not write Shakespeare. They can share something that's deeply intellectual in very plain writing. And often writing that is accessible is the most effective writing. And accessible writing is clear, it's concise, it's not cluttered, it's not fancy. I think quite often students, unfortunately, let their writing get in the way of the thing they're trying to say. And so they don't need to dig for the thesaurus. A 5-cent word is better than a 25-cent word. And so, instead of encouraging your kids to, produce the capital B, capital W best writing possible, I would encourage them to look for clarity and simplicity. If they can read it out loud and it sounds articulate, it's probably pretty good. I mentioned earlier, like I'm a word nerd. Part of that is I love writing. I love reading essays. It's one of my favorite parts of my job. So I have a lot to say about essays. I'll just wrap up my remarks, and then if it's okay with Sean, I can take questions. With just a little bit about what happens after your students click submit. The work that my colleagues and I do, during the winter months, and what highly selective admissions really means. The short version is, it just means there are many, many more qualified candidates than spots. At some level, like evaluating, like ranking becomes silly. Like really, we're not ranking the however many thousand kids apply and taking the top 1150. We're looking to build a class of 1150 separate, distinct, constructive, and exciting voices. I mean, we want them all to be different voices, bringing different perspectives, different backgrounds, different academic interests to campus. We need to be convinced that they can not just handle the rigor of a Dartmouth curriculum, but thrive in the rigor of a Dartmouth curriculum. And, our curriculum is a little bit different than other schools. We don't have semesters, we have academic quarters. They're 10 weeks long. The pace is a little bit quicker. Students take only 3 courses at a time instead of 4 or 5, but those courses move pretty quickly. So we're kind of looking for students who fit with that kind of curricular delivery. We're looking for students, again, who are going to contribute to our community, and, who aren't just going to, survive here, but are going to thrive here and are going to help other students thrive too. So, it's the highly selective piece of that is really about looking for fit. Academics are a big part of it. I would say, broadly speaking, 2/3 of a class that applies is academically qualified to do the work. So if we have 25,000 kids apply in a year, let's say 16,000 kids roughly can do the work at Dartmouth, they would be fine. We could admit 1/10 of those kids. I would say of those 16,000, probably 8,000, have really eye-popping credentials. And, so about a third of our pool is qualified to thrive at Dartmouth academically. And we could admit, an eighth of those. So it becomes less and less about ranking and more about just looking at the perspective students are going to bring to a class, trying to make nuanced decisions, trying to evaluate everything in a file and project like how that applies to our community. It is really difficult. I will say this. Right now I'm reading applications all day long, every day, and it's very exciting because like in this part of the review process, I'm familiarizing myself with files. I'm making kind of an initial course sort, if you will. I think I mentioned that 2/3 of the students are qualified. The students who aren't qualified, I still review their file, but I might set it aside for a second colleague to look at to confirm that, like, okay, probably not qualified within the context of our pool. Doesn't mean the student's a bad student. No, the student's a great student. It's just our pool is very competitive. And then, later on this winter, I'm going to take a second look at files and the ones that are qualified to thrive and look at those and think about, like what makes that file truly exceptional. And then I will gather with my colleagues and we will make very, very, very difficult decisions about which of the students who are qualified to thrive are going to be admitted and which will not be admitted. I love the part of my job where I meet kids and read applications and just like read all these great life stories. I would do this part for free. The part you got to pay me for is like making these very, very difficult decisions. We put a lot of thought into this, from February 15th or February 1st, really, until decision release date. I see a lot less of my family than I would like. I think about I think about my job virtually all the time. We spend a lot of time debating these files, debating these students, and I know it seems like I'll conclude my remarks with the same way I started my remarks. Admissions might seem like this opaque black box where these mysterious decisions happen. It's just a bunch of people trying to do the best we can, making very, very difficult, very fine decisions. This is a human process. It's human on your end with your students. It's human on my end with my colleagues. And at the end of the day, highly selective admissions means that there's difficulty on both sides of the process. Fewer students are admitted than we would like, and the decisions that go into that are very difficult. I think that's all about all I had in my notes here. I also have to apologize. I had a thumb drive with a presentation with actual slides, so you wouldn't have to stare at my mug this entire time. And I visited my office for the first time in ages last week and left the thumb drive in my office. So anyway, I apologize that you've just had to stare at my mug this whole time. I hope this is helpful. I'm happy to answer any questions that folks might have.
Mr. Bordeau, before we open it up to questions, I do want to say thank you again for your time. That was incredibly informative and definitely well appreciated and well received. Also, if you would like to share that presentation with me, I can post it to the website, so your time in crafting it wasn't in vain. So
Sure.
Feel free to send it my way. With that being said, we'd love to take some questions. If anyone has any questions for Mr. Bordeau, please feel free. Now's the time. You can enter them in the chat. If you're a little shy about unmuting your microphone, that's fine too. Oh, someone has raised a hand. Feel free to unmute.
Yeah, just unmute yourself.
Hi, Mr. Bordeau. My daughter's a junior, and I was curious in terms of the testing that you alluded to early on in your presentation about whether class of 2026 will be testing optional. What time frame, and of course I know you don't decide that, but what do you think when will we know by whether it's testing optional for class of 26?
I suspect I would be surprised if it's before we admit the class we're working on right now. So that's March 15th. I suspect by June 1st. That would be my guess.
And if I can ask a follow-up
Yeah.
based on that, because some of the students, I'm sure some of the parents here, some of the students are registered for the March SAT. And as I'm sure you know better than we do. I mean, they've got a lot of anxiety about it because they can register, prepare, and then the test gets pulled out from underneath them.
Yep.
What would you advise in an unofficial capacity, obviously? Should they take it? Should they sit for the SAT, or should they hold off for the next offering, which I believe is June or August?
This would make me unpopular with the students, but I think they should take it. And I think because, if we do end up requiring it and they, passed up an opportunity to take it, that's a bit of a bummer. The SAT, among many things, just measures how well you take the SAT. And so, odds are many students do better the second time than the first time. So if they take it in March, they've already got kind of one test under their belt. And then if they take it again in June or later, they'll probably do a bit better. I also think they should take it, also, even if we end up being test optional, just because, there's a little bit less pressure in that situation. If they do really well, great, they got a good test. If they have a bad day, they don't have to submit it. So no big deal. But I think they should take it.
And just one last follow-up. I apologize for monopolizing. If they take, let's say, 2 or 3 sessions or options of the test, how does the university average the scores? How do they, receive the scores? How are they processed?
Yeah, it's called superscoring. So this happens in the SAT, but not the ACT for Dartmouth. Different schools have different policies. Almost everybody superscores the SAT. Some places superscore the ACT. And superscoring just means that we only look at your best score from each section. And so like in my portal through which I read applications on my computer, I don't see all the dates they took it. I literally just see 2 scores, their best evidence-based reading and writing and their best math. So we take their best results.
Is that a universal process that do all universities, or is that specific to Dartmouth?
Almost all universities will superscore the SAT. The ACT varies depending on where you're looking.
Thank you very much.
Sure. There was a question I saw about applying as an undecided student versus applying with a major, and if that matters. That's a really good question. It matters a little bit depending on where you're applying. At some colleges, you'll apply to the engineering college or the College of Arts and Letters or whatever. And so then it certainly matters. At others like Dartmouth, you don't declare your major until the end of your second year. And when you apply, you're just applying to the college. You're not applying to our engineering program or our humanities program or anything. You're just applying and you take what you want. So we ask for their interest. I wouldn't say it really factors into a decision, except for, if a student indicates an interest in engineering and their math and science courses are the weakest part of their application, that's a problem. If a student indicates an interest in English and their math and science courses are the weakest part of their transcript, that's less of a problem. I will say that I do some institutional research for our office, and over the past few years, I've tracked what students declare as their academic interest when they apply versus what they major in and what they graduate with. And it's right around like the most it's a coin flip whether or not students actually end up majoring in what they say they're going to major in, at least at Dartmouth. I think there are very few departments where 60% of the kids actually convert. It's actually usually less than half convert. But anyway, questions popping up. But yeah, so just if you have an academic interest, list it and don't worry about like it impacting chances for admissions. I saw 2 questions popped up and they disappeared. I'm not as fluent with Google.
That's fine. I can read them to you. The first one that came through, how does the admissions process work when being recruited for a specific sport? I'm assuming the admissions board has the final say regardless of what the coach wants. Can the offer be rescinded if the grades are not there?
You're asking the right person. I've been at Dartmouth for 13 years, but I've only been in the admissions office for 5. I worked for 8 years as the head coach of the varsity heavyweight rowing team. And so I am intimately familiar with the recruiting process. The admissions office and the coaches work hand in hand. Athletic recruiting happens on a different time frame than the rest of the application process, but there is the same academic review. So, the way it'll happen is generally a student will reach out to a coach and express interest in their program. If the student has times or game tape or whatever that is interest, that the coach finds compelling, that the coach thinks is really good, the coach might say, okay, yeah, let's talk, let's introduce you to Dartmouth. And as part of that process, the coach will often ask the student for their transcript and for their testing. And they'll share that with me starting July 1st before the senior year. And I will look at the transcript and look at the testing and say either, yes, this student is viable academically, or no, they're not viable. Or in some cases, I'll say, we need to see the grades improve for them to be viable, or the testing improve, or something like that. Then over the summer, students will kind of narrow down their college list, and coaches will narrow down their list of top recruits. A coach will have a limited number of spots in their recruiting class, many more interested students than they have spots for. And then starting around the fall, a coach will come to me or come to the admissions liaison with their kind of priority list and say, okay, earlier in the summer, you said this student was viable. Here are their grades. Are they still viable? And I will either say yes or no. And then the coach will encourage the student to apply with the good faith that if the student puts together a really good application, does their very best job, they have a high chance of being admitted. To answer the question directly, yes, there are instances in which an offer of admission is rescinded even after a coach has made a student a promise. That is usually more about what the student has done than what the coach has done. And what I mean by that is coaches will get in a lot of trouble, like being fired trouble, if they promise a student a recruiting slot and don't give it to them. Usually if an offer is rescinded or if a student is not admitted after they're being recruited, it's because they'll just have punted the application. They'll think, oh, it's done, it's dusted, I'm admitted to Dartmouth. I'm just going to put the minimum possible effort into the application, and I'll read it, and it's embarrassing. But so the admissions office does have the final say, but we work closely with coaches, starting again pretty early immediately after junior year of high school.
That's great. The other 2 questions that came in, we're just looking for clarification on the Superscore policy. One of our counselors, Mrs. Gluck, is also here. She did respond to that in the chat. It was just really a question asking if a student were to take the SAT twice and do better on the math section on one test, the English on the second test, would the scores be accepted even though they were not from the same test? And Mrs. Gluck indicated you send them, and your highest score from each section on each test would be combined.
Yep.
We had another question just asking, is the Superscore the same for the ACT? And again, Ms. Gluck just reiterated what you had said. Dartmouth does not Superscore the ACT. Many other institutions do not. There are those that do. But you would, again, have to send your full complement of test scores from each exam for them to bring those sections together. Do we have any other questions for Mr. Bordeau as we come to the end of the evening? Let's see. Another question.
Yeah, I see that. there is about athletic scholarships. We have no merit scholarships of any kind. 100% of our financial aid is awarded on the basis of need. When do SAT scores have to be submitted? So students can self-report their scores. So, so that gives a little bit more, like the November test. I think we can use the November test for early decision. Students can self-report their scores. When we've admitted a student, we will ask for an official score report. And if there's any difference between the self-report and the official report, that's going to be a big problem. But generally, the College Board is getting better and better about delivering results quicker and quicker. So I think the last is November, the November SAT for early decision, I think. And then December for regular, I think. I'm rusty because, yeah, sorry.
That's fine. We do have a hand raised as well. If you'd like to unmute and ask your question, feel free to do so. I did see a hand raised. If you press Control D, that should unmute your microphone. Or feel free to use the chat if that's easier.
Dartmouth does not superscore the ACT. I think other places do.
All right. Well, before we let everyone go, just one final call for questions. Any other questions for Mr. Bordeau while we have him here? Okay. Well, again, Mr. Bordeau, I really would like to thank you again for your time, your talent, and this peek behind the curtain at the admissions process. One of the comments you made that I felt was so important was to highlight the fact that there are people on both sides of the table. And I think you gave everyone a view at really the very holistic process that you and other admissions representatives from colleges across the country go through when reviewing our students' applications. So thank you for this insight. We really appreciated it. Thank you, of course, to the parents who joined us this evening. And it was greatly appreciated again, Topher. Thank you so much for it.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good evening.
You too.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank
Everyone, have
Thank
a
you.